Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today's topic is kind of a stronger, a little bit heavy topic if you will, because we're going to talk about slavery in history. The inspiration for this topic actually came from a whole situation that occurred in 2023, which is of course has to do with politics. Now, as you know, I don't discuss politics, even less so American politics, since I'm not American, but it seems like that there is a whole situation when you go Google the idea of slavery, particularly in connection with Florida and new standards to teach, that has created backlash, whereby we had a standoff, as far as I understand, between the Republican DeSantis and the Democratic Vice President Harris. As I always say on this channel, people of all political persuasions are more than welcome in here, and all we do really is talk about the facts. And although I'm not going to address the politics of this, I'd like to discuss the topic of slavery from the perspective of actual documented evidence and facts. Already by reading the titles, we can get a little bit of a hint as to what this has to do with the teaching curriculum in the United States. We read, Florida's new history standard, a blow to our students and nation, says National Education Association. The NBC News says new Florida standards teach that black people benefited from slavery. And CBC News says Florida's new black history curriculum says slaves developed skills that could be used. And then from WUSF, we read Political Fact FL, do school standards say slaves benefited from slavery? So of course we can see that this not only has to do specifically with slavery, it has to do with the idea of, okay, but what sort of skills did slaves actually develop in the US specifically, and then it has to do with African American history. The idea of what sort of history is being taught in schools is absolutely something that I find a very strong item of interest of mine, not only because I'm a former school teacher and I used to teach, I did that for over a decade, and I taught both in middle school, in high school, and I've also taught through the EU funds of university and research, and I used to train teachers on how to teach. So that's definitely something that I think I can speak not from the perspective of politicians that know absolutely nothing when it comes to how you teach history at school, but from the perspective of someone who has spent over a decade doing the very thing, but also as someone who now speaks online and tries to shed light onto the most, let's say, fair representations of facts without politics in it. Now, I understand that some people will say, well, yeah, but even in history there is politics, and that's absolutely true. But one thing is discussing politics or political science from a historical standpoint, understanding exactly where things land with the aid of documented evidence, and the other thing is to allow propaganda to shape the way we present information specifically to a younger audience. And when it comes to propaganda, unfortunately, no side of the political spectrum is safe from it, because in this case, the accusation is that the right wing, or the American right, is trying to push a propagandized message to the students, trying to teach things that, according to Harris as a speaker, is incorrect. But then again, propaganda is pushed also from far left-wing positions too. I think the only person that can come to this with a more of an unbiased position is those who sort of set aside the political preferences and say, okay, but in this specific case, we are talking about slavery. It's a precise topic. Did slaves actually earn skills? And that is really the question we should ask, because in my opinion, a lot of what I've read on how these politicians have publicly handled this is an overreaction on both sides. Now, one of the things that I try to do in order to try and come prepared to this discussion is that I actually looked at this bill that oftentimes is referred or mentioned during these articles that talk about this situation, and I read the entire thing. It was probably one of the most boring experiences of my life, and I would have rather watched the grass grow. But really what I did understand from both reading what these politicians said and what the bill actually says, and how this Board of Education has prepared the information, I think everything really boils down onto how a teacher will present the information that has been prepared by the board. What I say by that is the following. If you take the statement, slaves learned skills by being slaves, if you take the statement in a vacuum and analyze it without any other context and say, okay, but is it true that some slaves may have developed skills as a result of the fact that they were slaves, then the answer to that is absolutely yes. It is possible that something like this had happened. But with that being said, it is also important to underline that as a teacher approaches such a statement, he should also probably underline to the students that slavery is indeed something that we as a society condemn. And of course, the simple fact that a slave may have learned skills due to the fact that he was performing work or labor, even though he wasn't paid for it, doesn't justify nor makes it beneficial to have become a slave. So I think the right way to approach this is, should we absolutely deny the very provable fact that if you take a person and put them in a cotton farm, or you put them in an ancient Roman encampment and force them to produce male armor, should we deny the fact that these people became really good at doing these things and absolutely learned a skill? No, I don't think we should deny it. But what we should do is to contextualize it correctly. So first say, freedom is always preferable. I think it's obvious, but let's say it. Freedom is always preferable to slavery, regardless of what skills you may have learned. Let's always condemn the fact that whenever we as a society, which is by the way what we did throughout the majority of the existence of human civilization, whenever we as a society decided, hey, I'm gonna use force and coercion, and I'm gonna use my position to take the freedom of this individual, whether they be white, black, Japanese, whatever, away from them and force them to perform labor for me without giving them anything in exchange and basically putting them in chains. Yes, that's a horrible thing. I think we can all agree that it's done for. We don't want to have anything to do with it. We shouldn't stop talking about it because it's important to present the facts, but absolutely we should condemn it. If you appreciate my content so far and wish to help ensure my ability to continue to tell it how it is, regardless of any possible backlash, please support this channel on Patreon. Any support helps me and my team of academics keep the channel strong and gives us the means to fight back against the political rewriting of history. Stand with us, form the wall, defend the truth. Which is why my position is the simple fact that you had a Greek slave in ancient Rome, and let's say that they were very educated, and then they were often forced to teach the kids of the wealthy Roman families. They learned skills and become excellent teachers as a result. Absolutely, I'm not going to hide that, and saying that is not racist, unless what you're trying to present is that, oh, therefore being a slave wasn't so bad, and in fact, you see, if you weren't a slave, you wouldn't have learned that. If that's what's being presented, that's nonsense. The experience of a slave is dehumanizing and it's horrible, and I agree with that statement. But what I disagree with is that doesn't mean that now, just because slavery is horrible, we need to hide facts. As I say, much of the labor used within Roman military camps came from slavery, and those slaves that were, for example, placed in a position where they were sort of helping with the production of armor and weapons for the army, they absolutely learned those skills. And I'm not gonna hide that and say, oh no, they didn't. No, they didn't, because slavery is horrible. That's quite pathetic in my opinion. And the way we should look at this from an educational standpoint is, how are the teachers teaching this? Are the teachers trying to justify slavery and say, oh, you know, it's overstated. In reality, Africans that were forcefully brought to America, you know, they didn't have it so bad. They were slaves, but you know, what was the alternative? Live in a mud hut? If that's the message, then that teacher should be fired, because you shouldn't teach that to your kids. You should absolutely teach the students, guys, slavery is horrible. Slavery is something that we have finally realized as a human civilization that it's not right, because it's taking these people's freedom away, and they would have absolutely been better off as free men. That's the core message. But on the other hand, if we are discussing, okay, that's the pretext of this whole discussion and teaching and lesson, now that we have said this, what did their experience as slaves look like? And therefore, if you point out a lot of bad things that happened to them, but among these you also want to say, look at this African man, he was a slave for 10 years, and regardless of this horrible fate that happened to him, he still became such a professional blacksmith that after he was finally freed, he used that skill that he had learned to better himself. That's something you can absolutely say, if it's a fact and it's documented, as long as you don't use it to justify slavery. I mean, that should be a given, but you use it to say, look at what he did, regardless of the shitty hand that he was given in his life. This is why I think that once again a moderate take is the only based take in this discussion or scenario. Don't hide the facts. Don't say, no, that never happened and you're not allowed to say that he learned any skills. Now that's nonsense from the left, but it would be also nonsense, obviously, to try and use this as a justification to say, you see, slavery wasn't so bad. But is that what this board of educators is trying to do? That's where I reach the limits of this discussion. I don't know, because I'm not that deep within American politics, even of a state that I've never set foot in. So that's the part that I'm asking you. What do you think about this whole situation? What was the reason behind this bill? What were they trying to do with these specific ideas? And what are your opinions on the remarks coming from both sides, Harris and DeSantis? Once again, as a former teacher and as a moderate, the position that I have is there are a lot of ifs that need to be taken into consideration. If what they're trying to say is that slavery was, at the end of the day, wasn't so bad, then of course that is wrong and shouldn't be taught. If the people are feeling offended by these statements, such as slaves may have learned skills, if they feel offended, even if the teaching environment is in fact being absolutely neutral about the facts stated and they are not trying to push or justify slavery, then that's a problem too, because it very much depends on how the information is presented and for what reason the information is presented. If the information is neutrally academic and what they are saying is not used as a way to justify slavery but it's just to state a fact of history, then the people that are getting offended by it are overreacting. Of course, on the other hand, if instead a teacher in school is using this to say, you see, you didn't have it so bad, and as he talks to black Americans and say, you should be grateful for the opportunity to learn these skills, then yes, that should be frowned upon. And once again, said teacher is in fact not doing his job right, and I say that as a former professional teacher. So a lot of ifs on this discussion, and perhaps this could lead, after I read your comments and commentary on this might lead to a separate sort of part 2. But thank you very much for watching as usual, and thank you for subscribing. If you're not yet a member of this community, become a noble one, subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.